The data was wrong. It had to be wrong. Veth-Soraal processed the atmospheric scan a fourth time, pushing the numbers through 3 different modeling frameworks, and each one returned the same result, with the same patient indifference of a machine that did not understand what it was saying. The oxygen concentration alone should have produced spontaneous combustion events in any organism with a metabolic rate above a certain threshold. The nitrogen-oxygen ratio was a fire waiting for permission. The surface temperature variance between the poles and the equatorial band would have killed every Skerath colony on the homeworld twice over. And the life. The scan's biological density readout had actually triggered a hardware alert. The instrument assumed it had malfunctioned. Veth-Soraal extended 12 of their chemosensory polyps toward the viewport, tasting the recycled air of the research vessel, as if it might tell them something the instruments had not. The Skerath did not look at things the way humans understood looking. They sampled the pressure history of a space, read what molecules had been moving through it, constructed reality from what had been, rather than what was. The viewport gave them nothing useful, just faint trace emissions from the hull's alloys, the ghost of the previous mission's navigator, who had apparently favored a synthetic protein that off-gassed from the skin for days after consumption. The planet below was not in their sensory range. They were grateful for that. They suspected. The quorum destabilized first along the secondary cluster 18 polyps that governed Veth-Soraal's emotional processing, which in Skerath physiology was not separate from logical processing so much as it was the medium through which logic moved. When the secondary cluster fractured, the thoughts it had been carrying scattered. Veth-Soraal lost their understanding of the word baseline for approximately 9 seconds. It was recovered from a backup cluster, slightly malformed. It came back meaning something closer to the condition before damage. They were still examining that when the human arrived. She came through the observation deck hatch without signaling her approach, which was a thing humans did constantly, and which still registered in Veth-Soraal's pressure sensors as a minor assault. The hatch displaced air. Air carried information. Unannounced arrivals were, to the Skerath, semantically equivalent to someone shouting a sentence without context. What the air carried this time: carbon compounds, something floral that was apparently a chemical the human applied to her body for social reasons, the particular metabolic signature of a warm-blooded endotherm running at 37 degrees Celsius, and underneath it all, at a concentration so low it was almost beneath detection, a trace compound that Veth-Soraal's reference library identified as soil microbiome byproduct, Earth-specific genus, inhaled or absorbed through skin contact within the last 48 hours. The human had been in contact with Earth soil on the ship. She had brought the planet in with her. Thani Osei-Mensah stopped 3 meters away the agreed-upon distance for initial interaction, a compromise between Skerath pressure sensitivity and human social instincts that apparently required closer proximity to feel they were communicating. And she looked at Veth-Soraal with those strange, forward-facing eyes humans used for binocular depth perception, which gave them the perpetual appearance of a pursuit predator, even when they were doing something as non-threatening as standing still. "You look," she started, and then appeared to reconsider her vocabulary. "Your outer polyps are doing something I haven't seen before." Secondary cluster fragmentation, Veth-Soraal managed, through the translation lattice, which converted their pheromone-coded thought language into vibrating air at frequencies the human's auditory organs could process. The lattice had been malfunctioning since they had entered Earth's system. It kept rendering Skerath distress chemical sequences as navigation alerts. 3 times in the last hour, the ship's collision avoidance system had briefly engaged. "Okay," Thani said. "Is that bad?" "It is disorganizing." The lattice stuttered. It rendered the next pheromone cluster as vector, uncertain, obstacle ahead. Thani glanced at the navigation panel on instinct. "I am having difficulty processing the atmospheric data." She walked to the terminal, read the scan results, and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Oh," in a tone that contained something Veth-Soraal could not immediately classify. It was not distress. It was not confusion. It seemed almost warm, The way a Skerath colony elder's pheromone signature warmed when they were shown records of the homeworld's deep geological past, before the atmosphere had settled into its current composition. A recognition of something known from a time before memory. "That's home," Thani said. "Those numbers are home." Veth-Soraal's secondary cluster destabilized further. 4 more polyps dropped off the quorum. They were losing the concept of normal distribution. "I can see that you are in some distress," Thani said, setting down the tablet and turning toward them fully. Is there something I can do? Pressure adjustment? I can lower the circulation fans." "The translation lattice," Veth-Soraal said. "It is not correctly rendering my distress signals. It has been alerting the navigation system." Thani's face did something. A rearrangement of its soft tissues that Veth-Soraal had learned indicated the emotion humans called amusement, though the line between amusement and discomfort was, in their observation, thinner than any Skerath would have considered functional. "That explains the collision warnings," she said. "Hold on." She went to the equipment locker. She came back with a panel of sensor foam, the material used to cushion delicate instrumentation during transit, and a roll of conductive thread and 2 translation lattice relay nodes she had clearly disassembled from. Somewhere she was not supposed to disassemble them from. She worked for 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The result was a pressure-sensitive pad roughly half a meter square, connected to 1 relay node, connected to a handheld interface, running a simplified pheromone gradient interpreter. It was not regulation equipment. It was not, technically, functional by any standard the Compact's research division would have recognized. It worked because it was built by someone who understood what it needed to do rather than how it was supposed to do it. "Try thinking at it," Thani said, setting it between them on the floor. Veth-Soraal extended a chemosensory polyp, made contact with the pressure surface. The interpreter read, "High alert. Environmental data contradicts survival models." "Yeah," Thani said. "I know. But look." She touched the viewport, spreading her fingers against the transparency. Below them, the planet turned. White cloud systems braided across blue ocean surfaces. The continental masses were mostly green-brown, alive in densities that made the scanner's biological readout flinch. It's been doing that for 4 billion years, contradicting survival models, and everything in it just figured out a way. Veth-Soraal processed this. The secondary cluster was still fragmented, which meant they processed it imperfectly, losing pieces of the argument the way a damaged pheromone trail lost meaning across a gap in the substrate. They pressed another polyp to the pad and sent the clearest question they could form. The interpreter read, "You came from that?" Thani looked at the planet. The soft tissue rearrangement happened again. Not amusement this time. Something older and more complicated, worn into the face the way geology was worn into stone. "Born and raised," she said. And then, after a pause that Veth-Soraal would later determine, had contained at least 3 separate emotional states in sequence. "Want to take a closer look?" Every polyp in Veth-Soraal's outer cluster contracted simultaneously. The pressure pad interpreter, faithfully doing its job, rendered this as, "Please confirm you are joking." Thani laughed. Veth-Soraal had learned that laughter was not a response to humor exclusively. It was, in humans, a pressure release valve for situations where their nervous system could not decide between threat response and delight. It appeared in both cases. It appeared in situations that were both simultaneously. They were beginning to understand this was a more common condition for humans than the Compact's xenopsychology briefings had indicated. "I'm not joking," Thani said, still doing the face. "I'm never joking about going home." The shuttle entered atmosphere, and the hull began to sing. Not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor. The friction of atmospheric entry at their entry angle produced vibrations in the hull alloy at frequencies that rang through the structure like an instrument struck by a variable force. Veth-Soraal, whose sensory apparatus was fundamentally a pressure reading system, sat inside the shuttle and received this as music. Discordant, variable, building. They were also receiving 47 simultaneous chemical alarm signals from their own body. The Skerath body was not designed for atmospheric entry. Nothing was. Even the human next to them, who had lived her entire developmental life on this planet, had been required to strap into a specialized harness for descent. The difference was that Thani had described this harness as precautionary, while tightening the straps with the ease of someone making a bed. Veth-Sooraal's harness had required modification to accommodate their form, and the modifications had taken 40 minutes. And at the end of them, Veth-Soraal had still not been entirely confident in the result. Thani had said, "You'll be fine." She had said it the way people said things they believed completely, without needing to think about whether belief was warranted. Veth-Soraal had found, in their weeks aboard the vessel, that Thani's belief in things had a peculiar relationship with evidence. She did not disregard evidence. She simply had a strong prior that things would work out, which had been calibrated, apparently, by a life in which things had mostly worked out, despite conditions that should have precluded them doing so. The hull sang louder. The cloud layer broke, and the chemical complexity of Earth's biosphere, which Veth-Soraal had been reading from orbit as a dense biological signal, which had felt on their chemosensory organs like standing in bright light after a long darkness, became, at an altitude of 2,000 meters, with the shuttle's air recycling system still running, something like standing inside a collapsing star. Not metaphor. Physiological fact. The sheer number of distinct chemical compounds flowing through the planetary atmosphere at low concentration metabolic byproducts, pollen proteins, fungal spore coatings, volatile organic compounds from decomposing organic matter across a surface area of 148 million square kilometers of land, was to Veth-Sooraal's chemosensory polyps. What? Attempting to read an entire civilization's literature simultaneously would have been to a human eye. Signal density past the point of interpretation. Data that became, at sufficient volume, indistinguishable from noise. They retracted all but 4 of their outer polyps and attempted to breathe. The shuttle landed in a clearing in what Thani had described as a temperate forest, at a time of year she had described as late summer, in a region she had described as home, technically, or one of them. The shuttle's landing gear settled into soft earth. Through the hull, Veth-Soraal tasted the disturbance of the soil and received approximately 200 novel compound signatures before they stopped trying to count. Thani popped the hatch. She stepped out and stood in the air and breathed. Veth-Soraal watched her through the open hatch. She did not recoil. She did not show any chemical alarm response in the micro-expressions their instruments were calibrated to read in human faces. She looked at the trees, which were very large, which were metabolizing at a rate that meant they were exhaling oxygen and water vapor and dozens of secondary compounds simultaneously, which were in every biological sense active organisms in the immediate vicinity, and she looked at them the way Skerath elders looked at records of ancestors. Recognition. Ease. Veth-Soraal climbed out of the shuttle. The soil gave slightly underfoot. Their pressure sensors read it as a living system, not metaphor, literal fact. The soil was a living system. There were organisms in every cubic centimeter, fungi and bacteria and nematodes and things their reference library flagged as unclassified. The soil moved and breathed and processed and decomposed at a rate that made the biological density of the station's hydroponics bay look like a clean room. They stood in it and attempted to continue having a quorum. A bird landed on Thani's shoulder. It was a small bird, brown-patterned. It regarded Thani with one circular eye, in the way birds regarded everything with total apparent confidence that the world was arranged for its convenience. And then it made a short vocalization and stayed where it was. Thani did not notice. She was looking at the tree line, one hand raised to shade her eyes from the sun, completely unaware that a vertebrate organism with hollow bones and a metabolic rate of approximately 37 microliters of oxygen per minute per gram had landed on her shoulder and was, as far as Veth-Soraal could determine, perfectly comfortable doing so. Veth-Soraal documented this for 11 minutes. At the 11-minute mark, the bird left. Thani turned around. She saw Veth-Soraal watching her. "What?" she said. "There was a bird on you," Veth-Soraal said through the portable lattice relay they had brought for surface use. "Oh yeah?" She looked at where the bird had been perched, as if she might find evidence of it. "What kind?" Veth-Soraal checked their visual capture. "I do not know. I cannot find it in the Compact's taxonomy. Probably a sparrow," she said. They're everywhere. She began walking toward the tree line, and because Veth-Soraal was here to document, they followed. The forest floor was not clear. It was layered with decomposing organic matter, small invertebrates, root systems that broke the surface and created irregular terrain, spiderwebs at various heights, fungi in multiple growth stages, and approximately 15 varieties of plants that the Compact's contact hazard database flagged in 3 different risk categories. Thani walked through all of it. She was barefoot. Veth-Soraal's instruments read the soil through her skin contact as transmitting 17 known pathogens, 4 known parasitic organisms, 1 organism with no compact classification whatsoever, which Veth-Soraal recorded with the slightly desperate attention of a scientist watching their reference model fail in real time. Dr. Osei-Mensah, they said. Thani, your feet. She looked down. What about them? The soil contains. I know what's in soil. She said it without sharpness, without dismissal, in the tone of someone clarifying a factual matter. I grew up knowing what's in soil. My immune system knows too. She looked at Veth-Soraal with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Did you know that human children who grow up with regular soil contact have significantly stronger immune responses in adulthood? We're not separate from the biology here. We're part of it. Veth-Soraal processed this. They were still processing it when the bee arrived. It came from the southeast, at an altitude of approximately 60 centimeters, following a flight path that appeared to Veth-Soraal's instruments to be erratic, but which Thani later explained was entirely purposeful. Bees navigating by magnetic field and polarized light in ways that only looked random from outside the system. It found Veth-Soraal's outer membrane casing, which was, technically, a temperature regulation surface, not a biological organ, but which the bee apparently found interesting and landed on it. The quorum froze. Every polyp that was currently extended retracted. Every chemosensory function went to standby. Veth-Soraal became, for approximately 4 seconds, the most still thing in the clearing, because movement was what the Skerath body did when it was confident. And in this moment, Veth-Soraal was not confident about anything up to and including their continued existence as a unified quorum. The bee explored the membrane casing with its front legs. Don't worry, Thani said. She had turned around. She was watching with the forward-facing predator eyes that meant she was looking directly at a thing she found interesting. It's just curious. It has a venom delivery system, Veth-Soraal said, through the portable lattice, at a volume calibrated to not disturb the bee. Stinger, yeah. But it won't. The bee stung the sensor housing on Veth-Soraal's outer casing. It was not a significant event, physically. The sensor housing was hardened equipment. The bee's venom reached no biological tissue. The bee itself, which Veth-Soraal would later learn died after stinging because the stinger was barbed and removing it was fatal, fell from the casing to the forest floor, where it lay and kicked for a short time and then was still. Thani laughed. The sound came out of her uncontrolled, the pressure-release laughter, the kind that arrived without permission, the kind that the Skerath pheromone library labeled as response to incongruity, exceeding cognitive threshold. She covered her mouth with her hand. She was still laughing. I'm sorry, she said. I'm sorry, it's not funny. You are still laughing, Veth-Soraal observed. I know. She breathed. The laughing subsided. She looked at the dead bee with an expression that moved, in sequence, through amusement, through something more complicated, through what might have been guilt. She crouched down near it. Poor thing, she said quietly. She felt grief for the organism that had just attacked them both. Veth-Soraal recorded this. They recorded it carefully, with the same thoroughness they had given the unclassified soil pathogen, because it felt like the same category of data, something that did not fit inside the existing frameworks, that would require a new category to contain. That evening, sitting inside the shuttle with the hatch closed and the chemical complexity of Earth reduced to a manageable trace level, Veth-Soraal opened the Compact's planetary risk registry.